Welcome to this edition of the Times Techies webinar series, the first in 2021. Wish you all a very happy new year. My name is Shilpa Fadnis and I have with me my colleague Sujit John. We both have been technology and business reporters at the Times of India for a long time. The two of us will be moderating today's discussion. Our discussion today is on Docker and the Docker ecosystem in India. Docker sparked the container revolution that has drastically simplified the lives of developers. Docker helps developers build lightweight and portable software containers that simplify application development, testing, deployment across multiple environments. To take us through the Docker ecosystem, we have with us Ajeet Raina. Ajeet is the only Docker captain in India. Docker captain is a distinction that Docker awards select members of the community that are both experts in their field and are passionate about sharing their Docker knowledge with others. Ajeet runs the Docker Bangalore Meetup community, the largest community in the world with over 10,000 members. He won the Tip of the Captain's Hat award in Docker conference in San Francisco in 2019 for his tireless blogging. His personal blogging site, Collabnix, attracts millions of readers. He has written over 250 blogs around Docker, Kubernetes, and cloud. Welcome, Ajeet. Those who are viewing this can send in questions through the Facebook comment box. Sujit and I will put them to Ajeet. Ajeet has a presentation after which we will have a discussion with him. Over to you, Ajeet.
Thank you, Shilpa. Thanks. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining today. I am here to talk about Docker, especially Docker trends and everything you want to know about Docker today. And for next 20 to 25 minutes, I will be talking about Docker, especially why we need Docker and what are the current trends. And then after that, I will be open for a Q&A where you can drop your questions in the Facebook and we will be taking that. So let me get started. So let us start with something statistics, right? Because everyone likes statistics. So I will pick up a kind of a Gartner recent report where Gartner talks about, okay, by 2023, 70% of the organization will be running 3 or more containerized application in production. Now you might be thinking about, okay, what's driving this significant growth? Now there are 3 important patterns which you are going to see. The first one is containers, second one is Kubernetes, and the third one as a microservices application. So in this webinar, I am going to touch base on the first 2, which is containers as well as a microservices application. So let's see why, why we are talking about 70% of the organization. That's huge, right? Now, think of it as like when we talk about a successful software development, so there is a general consensus saying like there are 3 important things which has to be in place. The first one is architecture, second one is process, and the organization. Now, to start with the organization, it is believed that when you have a small autonomous team, your organization tends to contribute on a small modules. Basically, you have a small team of engineers where you get them involved in building some kind of a module. Talking about the process, now Agile is a process where your team is basically broken down into the smaller and a smaller team, and they can collaborate with each other they can collaborate with each other to build the software. Now there is a general consensus saying like when you have a small organization and when you have an agile process, your software development lifecycle is going to be really robust. Now let's talk about the third one, which is monolithic versus microservices. Now, as we saw that Gartner has basically out of those 3 containers, Kubernetes and microservices, let's see like why Gartner is predicting based on the statistical report why the microservices is really important. So let me talk about monolithic first. So if you go back around like 15 to 20 years, your application has changed dramatically, right? So your application was kind of a big monolithic. It is a big blob of binaries and libraries. They were built on a single stack, just like .NET and Java. So there was a time where you take around 6 months of time to build some software. It is a long lived, and you deploy it in a single server. I do remember when you had a kind of an end user guide of around 100 pages, which mentions about, okay, what are the changes in the hardware. So it is very slow changing. It's a big server. Imagine that you are building a very complex application like online store. Now, if you closely look at Monolithic, you have a front end, you have a business logic, and on the right hand side, as you see, we have a back end. Now, talking about a business logic, it is basically a different modules which you build and you package in the form of a jar or a var. So you call, in the Java language, you call it as a jar, and in a Tomcat you say it as a var, right? So so all these modules are packaged in the form of a monolithic application, which means that you just can't go ahead and make changes to it. Once you make the changes, you never know that that application is going to, you know, um, crash. So which means that your business logic needs some kind of, these are like very, they are very tightly coupled. You can't just go ahead and make the changes. Now, if you look at this monolithic application, there is a general consensus saying like every successful application keep growing. So when you work in any of the application, it might start with around 200 or 300 MB in size. And after 3 to 4 years, that grows to around 1 GB, right? Which means that whatever the application which you have built successfully, it keeps growing. But there are certain challenges which you face. Now think of it as like the challenges in terms of making changes in terms of the technology. You just can't go ahead and make the changes in the technology. So one application which you have built in Java or .NET, and tomorrow if you come up with a new programming language, it becomes very difficult. So there are certain demerits which we have seen with monolithic application. Now, talking about the microservices architecture, which means that your business logic is going to change in the way that every modules which we're talking about, catalog service, reviews, order service, has its own database, which means that I can go ahead and build a catalog service on .NET, whereas the review service, I can choose my own technology, which could be on Java, right? Earlier in a monolithic application, when you have a single application sitting in a one single server, you didn't have a flexibility to change the programming languages, right? But now each of these services are in the very microscopic, means these are like in a microservices. There are small services having their individual database. In monolithic, we had a single database. Here we have a individual databases, and which are very small in size. Now, the benefits of microservices is like you can go ahead and scale this independently. Okay. So you don't have to scale the whole system itself. If I am working on an order system, okay, or if I am working on some kind of an order service, which means that I don't have to scale the whole system itself. I just can go ahead, concentrate on my service, which has its own database, and then make the changes without affecting the other. The other advantage is in monolithic, if you have a one component failure, which means that your whole system fails, right? But in microservices, one component failure is not going to affect the other, which means that your entire system doesn't have to go down. And one of the most benefit, I would say the point with the microservices architecture is you can use the latest technologies to build it. You might have seen the engineers coming in, the young engineers coming in and trying to recommend some kind of the languages, saying like, why are you using the old WordPress application? Why don't you go ahead and use some kind of a, modern tools? So they can go ahead, they can play around with it. And when you feel like that's matured enough, you can absorb that. So that is one of the advantages. Now, microservices architecture are good, but think of it as like when you have hundred and thousand of those microservices, which means that you have hundred and thousand of those application which has to be scaled across a different environment. Think of it as like you build something, you as a developer build something on your laptop, and when it goes to the cloud, you never know that that stuff is going to work. Think of it as like when last week when I was working in some kind of an IoT devices like Jetson, I built some kind of an application, and if I take that application and deploy it on the cloud, you never know that that application is going to work. which means that when the whole journey of your software is not smooth at all, moving from a development to test and QA, production and scale out. So you need to think of some kind of a tool which can help you help you make your application portable across all these software development life cycles. And that is where the Docker comes in. So Docker is the way how you basically package your application along with its dependencies, which means that, say, if I package some application on my laptop which is running on Windows, and when you go ahead and deploy it over the cloud which has a Windows instances, which means that that application carries all its libraries, binaries, dependencies, which allows you to run those applications everywhere, almost everywhere. And the other thing is, it provides you with the isolation, which means that without impacting, you remember that in the microservices, we talk about an isolation where each of these microservices are the independent entities, right? And they talk to each other through the APIs. So Docker basically isolates the apps. It works on all the Linux distribution, pick up any of the Ubuntu, Debian, OpenSUSE, Red Hat, it works on top of it. And itself, today the containers are native to Windows Server and Windows 10 also. When you say Docker, it is based on the container-based technology. Now you might be thinking about, okay, how is containers different from virtual machine? Now, if you look at the slides, you can see in a virtual machine, you start with the hardware, you have an host OS on top of it, and you have an hypervisor, which could be a type 1 or type 2 hypervisor. But on top of it, you have a full-fledged virtual machine, which has a guest operating system, which means that if you deploy a kind of a Windows machine, it will be like, by default it start with like 40 GB. Now if I want to test some kind of a Python application, why do I need a complete operating system? And that is where the Docker comes into the picture. Now looking at the right hand side, you have a containers. Basically you have a base as a hardware. On top of it, on top of that, you have a host operating system, and then directly you run container on top of it using the Docker engine. And the way how it works is, you are basically eliminating those 40 GB of complete operating system. So when you say containers are just a user space of an operating system. When you talk about an operating system, right, it is made up of user space as well as a kernel space, but the kernel is something which is shared by all these containers. Now, why Docker is so damn popular? You might ask this question, right? Now, there are certain factors. So few of the important one is, it simplifies the lives of developers. As a developer, if you want to start developing some kind of an application, you don't want to spend so much time in building the infrastructure, right? Why should I really care about whether I am on the Linux or Windows, right? As a Python developer, I should have a Python application up and Python environment up and running. It doesn't matter that I need to first. So think of it as like, today is the first day of in your office, and your manager comes and asks you about, okay, can you start working with the Python? And the first thing you ask is, okay, which OS shall I pick up, where Windows or Linux? So it shouldn't matter to you. You should have a kind of a containerized environment where you should have the environment where your Docker is installed, and that's it. You just say Docker pull Python, and you have a Python environment up and running. So it simplifies the lives of developers. It is portable for sure, because you build something on your laptop, it runs on cloud, it runs on IoT. It is very easy to deploy. Just think of it as like run one command, right? If I want to install Ubuntu, what do you need? The first thing is you need a server, or you need a kind of a laptop. On top of it, you need a CD drive. Burn it with Ubuntu, which is like 400 to 500 MB. Burn, and then you have to use some kind of an automation tools like Puppet and Terraform to build up some kind of application on top of it. For when we talk about Docker itself, right, it is just a matter of a single liner command, Docker pull Ubuntu, and that's it. You have an Ubuntu image sitting on top of your on your hard disk, and you just say Docker run, and you run it, right? So it is very easy to deploy your application. It shines for microservices architecture, because If you have ever worked with the Docker Compose, which builds the microservices architecture, you just have to specify one YAML file and that's it. Just with one YAML file, I can build up a whole WordPress application, right? So you can use it for microservice architecture. The faster software delivery. Now, if you are in a DevOps world where you have to deal with the application, there is a lot of automation, CI/CD pipeline. So Docker can really help you to expedite that. It accelerates your software development cycle, and then it uses it like more efficient use of system resources. Think of it as like a virtual machine which is using like around 40 to 50 GB of your Windows, to run a Windows host. In the same way, containers can be run in just like 600 to 700 MB, and if you talk about Linux, it is just like 20 to 30 MB, right? You can run your application on top of it. Now, these are the, like, if you are a quite beginner, right? These are the vocabularies which you can go through it. It start with a Docker image. Now, you might be thinking about what is Docker image and containers. So Docker image is your full-fledged application. Okay, it is basically an instance of your complete file system which runs your application. Okay, when you run that Docker image, it becomes a container. So container, so most of the time, if you see, people might be saying like Docker container, Docker image. So it is just like when you run a Docker image, it becomes a container, right? And as soon as you run those containers, we have a CLI platform where you can go ahead. So when you install Docker, you get a server and the client architecture, and you just have to, run those kind of, we have a specific command for running a containers as well as pulling on the images. And when you talk about what is the intelligent entity which is managing all of these things, it's a Docker engine. Okay, so Docker engine is the way how you build, ship, and run your container application deployable on any of the platforms. So once you run a Docker software on your machine, it comes with a Docker engine, either in the server or on the client architecture. Now you might be thinking about, now there are so many images which get built up. Where are those stored? And then you have a Docker Hub, which is like a registry service. So Docker Hub is a public registry service. In the same way, you can have your registry service inside your infrastructure, which means that today you have a flexibility of storing the images. You don't have to use a USB drive to carry those images. You can push it, you can pull it within a matter of seconds. So as I said, Docker is an open platform which helps you to build, ship, and run. Now, what is this build, ship, and run? When we talk about build and ship, it is more related to the developer. So as a developer, when you start building your application, you start building your Docker image, and that is the build part. When you push it to the Docker Hub, that is a ship part. Okay, and when you pull that image, when your colleague or a customer pull that image and run it, that becomes a run. So build is for a development environment, ship is like storing and creating the images, whereas runs helps you to deploy those application. And these application which you build on your laptop can be run on the cloud itself. So one of the question which I usually get is, okay, where I can run these Docker images and containers. So these are all the platforms. I would say most of the platforms today, I play around with IoT a lot. It has been like around 2 years. I have been playing around with the IoT projects. You can run it on Raspberry Pi, Banana Pi, Orange Pi, Windows 10 laptop. You have a MacBook. You have a Docker desktop, the full-fledged Docker platform, which you can run on your Mac, on Windows. You can run it on the cloud, AWS, and then you have even GCP, Azure, everywhere you can run it. You can also install a virtual box and you can run on top of it. Today, you can even run it on the VMware environment too, right? So you have a flexibility, and those are like a diversified platform where you can run all those things. Now, thinking about looking at the statistic which developers, like, this is a recent report from Stack Overflow which talks about, okay, how the Stack Overflow is basically a community of the developers where developers invest and they engage so much time to learn things. Today, if you are applying for any job, right, so usually Stack Overflow reputation is being seen, right? So these are like a very essential platform where developers spend most of their time. And look at the statistic. So in a Stack Overflow developer survey 2020, around 60,000 developers participated, and they have voted for Docker as a most the most wanted platform, second in the most loved, and then the third in the most used after Linux. So Linux is like one of the popular, but you just imagine that Docker is one of the platform where people spend more and more time with. Look at the pools right now. You might be thinking about, so everyone, like every one of the individual, we have around 7 billion plus population, like, and out of that, those engineers, how if each of the engineers start pulling and pushing those images. Now this is a data which is coming from a Docker index. Now Docker index is like every after every 6 months, Docker publishes a statistic of the latest top Docker images in the form of a Docker index. Okay, if you go to docker.com website, you will see like every 6 months they are publishing it. And look at the number of pulls in just 1 month. It is like 11 billion. Okay, 11 billion pulls in last month. So this is the data which is coming on the month of July. In a June, there were like 11 billion pulls, which means that 11 billion times people have used it to deploy the application, to go ahead and run their application, build the application on top of either in the cloud or on-prem. And till now, 242 billion total pulls on Docker Hub has been reported, which is like from around 6 to 7 years ago, right? So these are the pulls which has happened, and there are around 7 million repositories, 7 million hub users. So it's a full-fledged kind of, it's a big community. And Docker is popular today because of the vibrating community. We do have a Slack channel where there are around like 20 to 30,000 plus people where you can go ahead and interact with them. And look at the installation. Even in the desktop, you have around 2.9 million desktop installation which has happened. Now you might ask, like, who is using Docker? And this is just a snapshot. Like, there are like hundreds and thousands of customers, right, who have been using it. Especially I'm talking about not customer but users, right? So these are the primary companies. There are prime companies who are using it. And these most of these companies were part of few of the meetup events which I did in Bangalore as well as in other states in India. But these people are using it, and these are coming from a different industries, finance industries. Some are in a kind of an IoT industry, right? Especially if you have seen the robotic platform, you might have seen the video of the latest Boston dynamics. They have few of the robots dancing, which was published on the new in the New Year day, right? So those runs on Docker itself. And these not it's not just like a kind of a hobby or something like that, but it is like a Docker is running in a production itself today. And it has been a part of your tech stack in most of the big companies, right? So I have worked in MNC in the last 13 years, and we have been using heavily inside the Redis lab. We used Docker heavily to go ahead, pull these images, bring up the NoSQL databases and all. And this is my last slide, which talks about, okay, you might be curious about, okay, I'm excited. I'm super excited now. How shall I start with Docker journey? So one of the first recommendation which I have is docs.docker.com. This is a documentation which you should start. But if you are really serious about going ahead and be a part of community, we have a Docker community Slack, which you can be part of it. Otherwise, I do have my own Slack channel, which has around 4,900 community members. We talk on a regular basis, especially on the daily basis, where you go ahead and you can contribute towards the Mobi projects, okay, which is again it falls under the umbrella of Docker falls under the umbrella of Mobi. So you go ahead, you pick up your technology, and you start contributing on top of it as a developer, as a product manager. So it is an open community. It is free of charge. It is just like you can join anytime. You start contributing on top of it. And dockerlabs.collabnix.com is a personal website, a personal community site where all the community members go ahead and contribute. So so we have a huge community members, especially in Bangalore as well as in India, abroad, who have been contributing, on the daily basis to this repository. So there's a lot of resources out there, but definitely you can start your Docker journey. And anyway, you can reach out to me in the Slack channel anytime, and I would love to collaborate and see like how we can collaborate together to contribute for Docker. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, can you? Okay. Great, great. Thanks a lot. Those who are viewing this, I think some questions have already started coming in. Those who are viewing this can send in questions to the Facebook chat box. Just for my end, I mean, since you ended with that, this docker.com and all that, anybody, even engineering students, computer science students, they can understand it.
Yes. So docs.docker.com is a site which is basically hosted over the GitHub. So any young engineers, when they start their career, the GitHub is the primary repository where they start the career with. So they are most of the engineers who has played with the GitHub, they should be able to go ahead and contribute for that. They can refer it to get started.
Okay, okay. You don't need to understand do you need to understand some programming language and all that to understand Dockers or Docker or what?
So Docker is based on the Go language at this point of time. So
Mhm.
they need to have knowledge of Go,
Is
uh,
it? Uh-huh.
yeah, to go ahead and contribute for those projects.
Okay. And the Bangalore community is the biggest in the world?
Yes, it's the biggest in the world. Today we have around 10,250 people.
Mm.
Yeah.
Which would be the second biggest?
So second biggest would be Docker Pune, which has around 5,500 members.
Okay.
And
Globally,
yeah,
US and all don't have these kind of communities.
it's kind of, yeah, it's growing at this point of time, but we do have a large community members who are like contribute a lot for the open source projects.
Okay, okay. Shilpa?
Questions coming in, Sujit.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
question is from Sumalata. Is there any course that you would suggest to get familiar with Docker?
Okay, so if you look at, there are multiple courses, especially we have few of the courses from Docker captains who have been posting it on Udemy. So if you really want to do a kind of a crash course kind of a stuff, I would recommend you can go ahead and do it. But what I would suggest, there are dozens of repositories which you can refer to learn about this technology, because uh, these ebooks and all those training centers, they are good for a time being. But Docker as a technology, it is basically, there are so many things which you can't just cover in the month of, I would say, in 10 days or 15 days training. So you have an integration with large number of cloud native application. You really need to understand how those application gets tied to each other, how it is built. So my recommendation would be, rather than sticking to any of these institute or online courses, it's better to stick to docs.docker.com, get familiar with the technology and contribute back to the community.
But you can, the community can help you. How do they get in touch with you if they want some help from you?
Okay, so one of the thing which you have seen, like with the rise of the Slack channel and Discord channels, right? These are the real time, the chat applications where you can go ahead, you can ping to the moderators. So each of these Docker projects have certain moderators or the major contributors, right? To whom you can ping them, you can reach out to them, and they ensure that they respond you back. Because these Slack community itself, now think of it as like a Kubernetes community which has around 1 lakh people. When you go ahead and post some kind of inquiry, there are people who are really helpful and they can help you out. Otherwise, we do have a forums where you can post the question and you can expect, you know you get an answer in a day or two. But because of the Slack channel, there is a kind of a really vibrant community which will help you out.
Okay. So easy to find those channels, is it?
Yes, it's very easy. You can go ahead, you can search for the channel specific to the product, and then you can start, capturing your whatever the query you have on top of it.
Okay. I have this question from Samir Sharma. I don't understand it. So, Ajit, you might. Can we run console thick client on Docker?
Yes, we can definitely run that. So this is one of the query which has come. The only thing what you need to do is basically you have to pass a privilege flag on top of it. Think of it as like, if you want to really run kind of some kind of a application. So when you build a kind of a Docker Compose file, you just have to pass the privilege flag and do some kind of a mount there. okay, to expose that, and that should be helpful. So I would suggest the user, if they can connect me through the Slack, I can help them out.
Okay, just for my interest, what is console thick? Um,
So
okay.
console thick is in one way, as a container, usually these containers are moreover like a command line. Okay. And if someone wants to go ahead and build some application which is GUI based, right? Now you have to go ahead and do some kind of a tweaking to make it work. As these containers are very lightweight, they are very smaller in size. It doesn't mean that you build a container and you dump all those 1 GB of your application. Now in the same way, if you want to run a GUI inside a CLI, right, so you need to do the tweaking, right? So so what they need is they want some kind of user access where they can remotely access on top of it. And for that to happen, you need to make some kind of a tweaking and mounts to make it work.
Okay. So Shilpa, more questions? No, a lot of questions coming in.
Questions coming in. But before that, Ajit, I just wanted to ask you, your areas of interest are Docker on IoT, legacy applications, cloud. So if you can just take us through each one of them.
Okay, sure. Now think of it as like in an IoT device, right? Now these IoT devices, they run some kind of a Linux or Windows operating system. Okay. Now the operating system architecture in IoT, mostly in most of the popular devices, they are ARM based, which means that whatever application you build on your laptop is not going to work on ARM based IoT devices. It has to be compiled. Okay. Now there is a lot of time a developer is spent to compile it. So think of it as like, say, I want to build an application which will, say, IoT based application where I have a Raspberry Pi, a small computer systems or Raspberry Pi boards installed on a different part of a city where I'm tracking whether the people are wearing mask or not. Okay. Now I want to build that application in this COVID pandemic situation. I want to track how many people are there. Now, when you start building this application on these small devices, you have to really build based on the architecture, which is like an ARM based architecture. Now, developer might spend more and more time in building this architecture on each of the device. Now, with Docker, if you build a Docker image for one of these ARM devices, you can push that to 100 of those devices, which means that I can package this application, I can give it to you, and then you can deploy it across all those ARM-based IoT devices. Just within a second, you can build that application. So in the past 2 years, I have worked on a couple of these projects. Especially right now, I am working on one of the robotic platform called as Cherrybot, which is like a payload carrying. So the whole idea is, say, inside a university, if you want to treat your robot as a Swiggy guy who goes ahead and distribute the food. Okay. Now that robot should go ahead, identify people, and based on that, it should identify the object, reach out to the right location, and then deliver the food package, right? Now these application can be built on top of Docker. Okay. I can go ahead, build those application in seconds. And for me to go ahead and update any kind of a firmware, to update any kind of an application packages, it's just a matter of a single line command. So I can control it remotely. So these kind of an application, you can build it very fast. And the one which you build can be used in a multiple platform itself.
Okay. I have this question. The previous question was from Samir Sharma. This question is from Khushbu Gupta. In your presentation, a lot of your examples were media houses. Any
Mhm.
specific reason why Docker would suit media organizations?
So the reason is, Docker application usage wherever, irrespective of, so whatever the example which I picked up are very latest examples, where they had a presentation on how they are using Docker, but it is not restricted to that.
Yeah.
Docker, wherever you have a software application running, you can have a Docker. You can have a Docker, you can have the packaging. It is all about the packaging of the application. So every software company builds an application, and it is not just, you might see some of the example, but you might be very surprised to see that all the IoT or the robotics platform, you know then all the banking, financial, and then so you just name the company, right? Because think of it is like 232 billion Docker images pool, which means that there are so many industries using it in a different ways, right? So the cloud native application today, if you see the cloud native landscape, it is like 100,000 of those, the customers are using it. So it's not just really restricted to the media houses. It's more like, uh, more like this application, wherever there is application, there can be packaging. And especially in these media houses, right? I think in these kind of a companies, you have both. You need a kind of a you want to go ahead and deliver a software very fast, right? So those kind of an application where you have a lot of changes which happen in between, that can be implemented with the Docker. So with the Docker, you can push it, you can push this application for a different environment, you can run it on the cloud. Say if you have a very heavy traffic on a particular day, say think of it is like in the Christmas time when you have so many things which is happening, like you have a heavy load, like on that, in that case, I can run those containers, I can spin up those containers in a large amount, right? At the same way, if the traffic is very low, I can just reduce the replicas of this application, and I can run very less number of those replicas of application. So it's not just like one example, there are multiple use cases where Docker is used today.
This question from Raghupati Rao. Can we tweak the microservices while the application is live in production?
Yes, for sure, we can do that. Today, if you see, so the thing is, whenever you run some kind of an application, it is not like you have one single replicas of those application running. So think of it as like when you run an application, you run it across multiple servers. So even if one machine where you go ahead, and so we have a concept called as a rolling update. Okay. So think of it as like you have a certain application, say X, and you are running 1.1 version of that application. And at the same time, you have a multiple replicas sitting on a different machines. Now, when you do a rolling update, when you change your application version from one version to another, you always do it in batches. Okay, so which means that your first 10 you in the first 10 seconds, you try to update certain piece of application, okay, certain replicas of application, and then the next replicas of application you do it in after 10 seconds. So it is not like so with the rolling updates, you can basically go ahead and update your application without any downtime. Okay, so it is still possible, and all you have to do is you really need to define those replicas and where they are going to sit.
Okay, a lot of questions. Yeah, well, let's take these first. Venugopal asking, what are the steps and prerequisites we should consider if we would like to deploy an application via Docker?
Okay,
Steps and prerequisites.
Okay, so I would recommend you should start with some kind of a best practices. So think of it as like, when you build some kind of an application, you start with building with a Docker image. Now, for building a Docker image, there are best practices. When you start building with the base of a base Docker image, you should not pick it up randomly from the internet. Okay, you should start with your own kind of built base images, and these base images has to be very smaller in size. Okay, so containers are lightweight, which means that you should not dump all those packages inside the container. You should always keep it lightweight. It should be very minimal. The other factor is, when you build a Docker image, you try to pick up all those dependencies packages. So you should keep it very minimal. There is a concept called as multi-build. Okay, so multi-build applications are those applications where whatever the prerequisite packages, that has to be built during the initial phase itself, which means that if I am deploying some kind of an open CV kind of an application on IoT device, I should not dump all those prerequisite packages too. It should be very minimal. And that is where you have a multi-stage build application which has to be followed. So in the same way, there are around 10 to 12 best practices, which you need to follow to go ahead and build those kind of an application. And you should ensure that when you build this application, since Docker concept is basically, it is abstracting, it is not dependent on the underlying hardware. You should consider that when you build the application, build it in a form of a multi-architecture. So when you build those applications, it should work on IoT devices as well as on any of the architecture which you are working on, say on your laptop, on a cloud. So it should not be restricted only to the ARM architecture. It should be on x86 hardware as well as on the IoT platform if you are building the IoT based application.
You mentioned you should keep it lightweight, keep it minimal and all that, but what if it requires some of those other things which are probably the developer considers necessary?
Yes, so that is the main problem where we are facing with the Windows container, because Windows containers are more like a DLL files. Today, the minimal Linux container is just like in bytes. Okay, within a bytes you can go ahead and deploy it. Think of it as like an Ubuntu container, which is like starting with 10 to 20 MB. But when we talk about Windows container, the minimal size is around 700 MB. You just can't go ahead and minimize that. When you minimize that, what happens? Your all the libraries and binaries gets interlinked, and that gets corrupted. The application is not going to work. So unless and until, so that is one of the problem where you face, where you see the companies who have been building the application in the past 15 to 20 years. Think of it as like an Oracle, right? Oracle is now a kind of a big software, right? You just can't go ahead and microsize it. Okay, and when you try to microsize it, you might break your application. So unless and until it is not required, it is not restricted, you should try to minimalize your the container size itself. But there is not a hard and fast rule, which means that every monolithic can't be microsized. We should not force microservices. If monolithic is working for you, you should continue with that. Okay, so but don't try to force yourself and try to convert those monolithic to microservices architecture.
Okay. Shilpa, you have something? I have something from
Yes, yeah. Go ahead, Sujit. Go ahead.
Okay. The Lata asking, before Docker came into the market, how were packages sent across for deployment? What did Docker change in the existing process?
Okay, so before Docker, we have a virtual machines. So what we used to do, we used to go ahead and so, VMware is a company which introduced a kind of a virtualization for the first time. And then before virtualization, we have a Solaris, which had a concept of containers, but those were very restricted to Solaris, okay, in the form of a Jones and all. But the real virtualization was introduced by VMware. And what we used to do is we used to go ahead and deploy a virtual machine. On top of it, you run an application, and that was some kind of an isolation. Okay, but slowly the industry realized that virtual machine is growing broader and broader. There's like bigger in size. There is some kind of a licensing which was involved and all of these things. And moving the virtual machine from one server to another is one of the biggest pain which the VMware administrator used to face, right?
Really?
So when you have 40 GB of Windows VM, and when you are trying to shift the VMDK file from one machine to another, that is a real pain, because it was taking a long time, right? You just can't go ahead and scale it, right? And the resources wise, right? Just think of it as like how many virtual machine you can deploy on your laptop based on your RAM. If I have like 8 GB of RAM and each VM is of 2 GB, I am restricted to just 2 to 3 VMs, but I can run 100 of containers, right, on top of it. So before containers, we had a concept of virtual machines where we were packaging, but it was a full-fledged operating system. But in terms of containers, we just have a user space of an operating system.
That brings me to the question that I asked you before the discussion happened. Is VMware says it's, and their whole pitch is you can run containers on top of VMs. That it's, in some sense, they are telling, what Red Hat may say a different story. But so what is your view on this?
Okay, so today you have both the options. So for running a containers, you really don't need VMs. Okay, containers can be run on a bare metal. It can be run on your IoT devices, on your laptop. Now, one of the thing which VMware has been there for a long time. They promise that they have a kind of they have all those features which is required for an application to go up and running. Think of it as like the scalability, the cloning, high availability, fault tolerance. So what industry doing right now is whoever have been a part of a VMware customer, they are adopting an hybrid kind of environment where they are running containers on top of a VM, which means that now you have a second layer of security on top of it. It doesn't mean that Docker is containers are secure. Container are highly secure if you go ahead and use those security features. Think of it as like every container which you run are run as a root user, but today you can run it as a rootless. You can run it as a normal user, right? So there are different models. So hybrid model says that today it is possible to run Docker on virtual machine. Okay. And when you say virtual machine, those are like an isolated environment. You get a security, you get high availability, fault tolerance, all of these features with it. So people have been using that, the engineers and the industry, the businesses have been using it if they are, but today most of the people have realized, think of it as like cloud now cloud is more like you run a kind of an instance and it is more like a virtual machines, right? Now when you deploy some, say if I deploy some kind of an application, I build some kind of an application on my laptop, and when I push it to the cloud, that is itself is running on one of the instance, which is nothing but a virtual machine, right? And with cloud you have around hundred of services which you get, right? It becomes very easy to go ahead and deploy it in any of the environment today. Even I have an ARM based cloud instances, so which means that if I have any application deployed on IoT device with the same architecture, I can run it on the cloud. So it is more like an hybrid model. So people are free to either run it on bare metal on virtual machine, or they can run it on cloud.
Do you have a preference?
I don't.
Okay. Shilpa?
Yeah, this question is from Samshvi. In the Docker ecosystem, are there roles and careers for people who are not into the software development side?
Yeah, for sure. So we have, with the DevOps, I would like to talk about the DevOps here. Okay. So DevOps are the individual who work very closely with developers as well as operations. So if you talk about my background, I am not a core developer, but itself, I have been using containers because with these containers technology, you don't really have to be a core developer. To deploy a container, you don't have to be a developer. Okay, you just have a few of the YAML file which you have to build. Say for a Docker file, it is a simple text file. For a Docker compose file, you have a YAML file. You just go ahead, say Docker run or Docker build, you build your application. So being an operations team, when you say operations teams, they are more like, working very closely with the developers, but they are like a system administrator. You go ahead, deploy those applications, those kind of a career path you can choose. DevOps would be the perfect path if you are not part of, if you are not a core developer, because right now you really don't have to learn any languages to be a kind of a DevOps engineer. You need to have knowledge about the tools and technologies. You should know how to collaborate with developer and build some kind of an application.
There are non-Docker containers also, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
So let me speak on that. So usually what happened, Docker is based on the container based technology, but it is not, it is just like, I would say 10 to 20% of the code is containers code. Okay. Now, when you say non-Docker containers, which means that there are other technologies which basically are based on the container. Okay. And they have been used by multiple companies, but Docker is one popular way of running those containers.
Okay. Okay. I have this question from Ravi R. To what extent have Indian software product companies adapted Docker?
I would say the huge number of companies, because the community which I have today on a Collabnix, so I have a community called as Collabnix community, and around 85 to 90% people, think of it as like out of those 5,000 people, 80 to 85 to 90% are only from India, which means that there are lot of people who are investing time building the technology, and there are lot number of community leaders. So I am also, as along with the Docker captain, I am also a community leader. We have around 4,035 Docker community leader all across the globe. And out of that, if you see who are those people who are managing those 30,000 plus people in India, those are like a community leaders, right? So we have a huge number of companies who have been working on container-based technology. They are certified. They are Docker certified engineers, Kubernetes certified engineers, right? So I would say most of the companies, I would say around 85 to 90% of the companies itself in Bangalore are trying to adopt and move to the container-based, technology, because that's the only that is not a kind of a future. It is a present. People are dependent on Docker. So in today's world, if you really want to survive as a DevOps engineer, or as a kind of, you want to start your career, Docker is a must. You need to know. As a DevOps engineer, Docker is a must. As a young engineer who want to start building their career, you should know the Docker. Even today, Kubernetes, in the recent version, Kubernetes, they are the Kubernetes as in software is now based on containerd. It will be based on containerd, but you still need to know the concept of Docker to understand the Kubernetes.
This question is from Rajesh. Between containerization platforms like Kubernetes and Docker, which one would you choose?
So I would say Kubernetes, I would say Docker is a kind of a container runtime. Okay. It is a container runtime which is used by Kubernetes as of today as a popular platform. You need both. If you really want to go ahead, say for Kubernetes is the way how you manage containers. Okay. So think of it as like using Docker, you can build and run containers, but to manage those containers, you need a platform like Kubernetes. Today, if you think of if you think of few of the application which has been running on 100 and 1,000 of nodes, right? Those are using Docker as a container based runtime, but Kubernetes is used to go ahead and manage those. Otherwise, when you have 100 and 1,000 of those containers, you really need to worry about whether those containers are up and running or not. So Kubernetes has all these features which you need to run those containers across multiple clusters, like auto scalability. You have high availability, fault tolerance, and then ensuring that your application is always up and running, right? So you need both. You just can't rely on one single technology.
The enterprise, an enterprise which is using Docker a lot, how many containers would they have, you think? A large
So
enterprise.
if you think at Kubernetes distribution itself, there are 100 Kubernetes distribution. Think of it as like operating system like Linux, Windows, and all. Okay. You might have 700 to 800 Linux distributions, right? In the same way, Kubernetes providers or the distribution itself are like, certified. I'm talking about the certified distributor itself is like 100, which means that if you are an enterprise customer, you really have to rely on those Kubernetes distributors, certified distribution. Otherwise, in an open source world, usually what happens when you have certain kind of an issues, you can't just go ahead and, in open source world, you can wait for 1 or 2 days, right? For an enterprise application, there is an SLA which is attached, which means that if there is any issue, that has to be fixed as soon as possible. So you rely on those enterprise customers, enterprise certified distribution to get those issues fixed. Okay. So you just can't imagine like there are hundreds and thousands of those containers might be running right inside the organization itself. So
Okay.
it depends upon the industry use cases. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Lots of questions over. Shilpa, done?
Yeah, some questions still queuing up. So yeah.
Yeah. Is it?
So Ajeet, meanwhile, I just wanted to ask you, what does it take to be a Docker captain? How many such captains are there globally?
Yeah.
So globally right now we have around 45 to 50 Docker captains all
Oh,
across
that's it?
the globe.
That's it?
Yes. And the thing is, for a Docker captains, it's all about contribution. It's all about how you build a community around it. It's all about talking about the latest releases and then reaching out to the community, building the community. So to be a Docker captain, one has to spend more and more time in Slack. One has to spend more and more time contributing for the community. So usually what happen when you learn any technology, you just keep it within yourself, right? And you try to excel it. So as it said, right, uh, when you basically, individually you specialize, right? Together you transform. In the same way, as a captain, you really have to keep track of what is coming next, and then sending out the right message to the community, trying to build the community. And at the same time, you have to be very active in going ahead and talking about the technology, so that you can share, you can build the community. So once you go ahead and engage with the community, contribute in terms of, so it doesn't mean that you have to contribute towards the code, but it is just like community involvement, talking about the new releases. And then one thing which I'm really fond of is blogging. So I have been writing all those blogs, not being a Docker captain, but more like an interest. And that is the reason today I'm like a community leader also, right? Because I have been driving the community across India.
So does Docker reward you for all this?
So I would say there is not a direct reward, but they do sponsor the visits which I have. So we usually, before COVID, we used to have DockerCon, one in US and one in the Europe. So they go ahead, they fund it, they take care of all those, the housekeeping stuffs, where
Okay.
we can go ahead, conduct a workshop, we can present on the latest technology around it and showcase our work. So those kind of, the help
Okay.
we get it from Docker. Yeah.
Shilpa, I'm done, huh?
Yeah, so we have no more questions. Thank you, Ajit. Thank you for that deep dive on Docker and how the ecosystem is shaping up in India. Really appreciate you joining us today, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would like to thank Shilpa and Sujit, both of you, because it's a great opportunity to get connected with the audience. And definitely, in case anyone who has query, do join my Slack channel, or you can come to the Docker community Slack, where we can collaborate, and then I can help you out and find the path forward. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Ajit.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.